Hi, this is Jim, and today we're going to take a look back at Kolchak, the Night Stalker, probably one of the most influential television series made in the 1970s, although you may or may not have heard of it. Darren McGavin is perhaps best remembered by most people today for his role as the father in 1983's A Christmas Story. However, for anyone who's been around a decade earlier in the 1970s, he will forever be known as Carl Kolchak, an investigative reporter who had a knack for stumbling into strange supernatural situations. This kind of Monster of the Week formula would later be used by such television classics as The X-Files and Supernatural. On January 12, 1972, ABC aired a made-for-TV movie that was destined to have lasting repercussions for decades to come. A literal smashing success. Over 33 million households turned in to watch this one movie. To give you an idea of exactly how significant this is, the highest number of people to watch a single episode of Game of Thrones was just over 20 million households. The ratings for the movie were so successful that ABC immediately released the movie overseas in theaters. The film was based upon a then unpublished novel by Jeff Rice entitled The Kolchak Papers. The story was about a reporter investigating a series of murders in Las Vegas who comes to believe that he might be dealing with a real-life vampire. The movie begins with a narration by Kolchak that sets up the story we're about to watch. The format of this narration was so successful it was used throughout the entire series. Let's take a listen.
Chapter 1. This is the story behind one of the greatest manhunts in history. Maybe you read about it, or rather what they let you read about it, probably as some minor item buried somewhere on the back page. However, what happened in that city between May 16th and May 28th of this year was so incredible that to this day the facts have been suppressed in a massive effort to save certain political careers from disaster and law enforcement officials from embarrassment. This will be the last time I will ever discuss these events with anyone. So when you have finished this bizarre account, judge for yourself its believability, and then try to tell yourself, wherever you may be, it couldn't happen here.
Okay, moving right along. Somewhere around midway through the movie, Carl begins to make the vampire connection based off the way the serial killer's been acting. It's important to note that at this stage of his character development, Carl doesn't believe in the supernatural, but he does realize that in order to catch a killer, you have to understand his methods and motivations. This approach we would come to know decades later as profiling through the FBI. This next short clip is my favorite quote for the entire Carl Kolchak series. To me, it's right up there with "You can't handle the truth" from A Few Good Men.
This nut thinks he is a vampire. He has killed 4, maybe 5 women. He has drained every drop of blood from every one of them. Now that is news, Vincenzo. News. And we are a news paper. We are supposed to print news, not suppress it.
You know darn well why we're soft-pedaling this thing.
No, tell me why. Could it be because we have been told to?
In the end, Carl was proven correct and the vampire was dispatched by driving a stake through its heart, just in time to have the cops storm in and threaten to pin a murder charge on him if he tells anybody about the true nature of the killer. After this movie was such a success, ABC immediately placed an order for 2 others, one to follow the next year and another one to follow the year after that. They were to be titled The Night Strangler and The Night Killers. This time, ABC stepped up their game a bit, and they hired Dan Curtis, the creator, writer, producer from the immensely popular soap opera Dark Shadows, which had just completed its first Dark Shadows movie, as well as wrapping up 1,200 episodes just the year before. While he was a producer for the first movie, he was also asked to direct the second one. As a result, you will see many of the same visual and audible cues used throughout the movie. It definitely has that Dan Curtis feel. The net result was very effective. Most horror and supernatural fans today will tell you that this was probably one of the scariest things they had ever seen when it came out. It left a lasting impression on Chris Carter, who would later go on to create The X-Files. The resulting ratings were just as good as the year prior, so ABC went back and had Dan Curtis add an additional 16 minutes of footage for the movie to be released overseas. The 90-minute version that was created then is what is currently available on Blu-ray.
This is the story behind the most incredible series of murders to ever occur in the city of Seattle, Washington. You never read about them in your local newspaper or heard about them on your local radio or television station. Why? Because the facts were watered down, torn apart, and reassembled. In a word, falsified.
The voiceover narration this time at the beginning of the movie was set over footage rather than it showing him actually recording into his tape recorder, which is a staple of his that'll stay throughout the entire series run. At the start of the movie, reporter Carl Kolchak shows up in Seattle, Washington, where one night he just happens to encounter his old editor Tony at a bar.
Vincenzo! Hello, what are you doing in Seattle?
What did I do in Las Vegas?
Well, you fired me. That's what you did in Las Vegas.
No, I didn't fire you.
Well, in that case, then you can hire me. Right, Vincenzo?
At the encounter, Tony Vincenzo does in fact hire him. As luck would have it, his very first case is to cover a series of killings in which the victims, all exotic dancers, are strangled, have their necks crushed, and then are drained of a few ounces of blood.
Yes, there's ruins underneath the streets here, what they call Old Seattle. There was this big fire back in 18-something or other, and for some strange reason I don't know about, they built it all back up, twice as big as it was before.
Yeah, you just did see what you might have thought you saw. Two very interesting things conducted in the same scene. One of which was the rather chauvinistic behavior of Carl as he body checks the blonde as she's talking to him. He's not exactly very subtle about where he moves his eyes. But the second thing you might have noticed is the blonde has a friend. And in the movie, they come out point blank and tell you that Wilma is actually her husband. So back in the 1970s, Dan Curtis was actually openly dealing with open gay lesbian relationships on a movie of the week that aired on Friday nights. I don't think most people would even believe that was possible if you hadn't seen this video clip. Dan Curtis made a brilliant use of the Seattle Underground, by the way. There is a real-life Seattle Underground, and it is similar to the one seen in Night Strangler. There were actually scenes filmed in it. After the Great Seattle Fire destroyed a few dozen blocks of early Seattle, the city's leaders decided to regrade the streets above the previous level due to flooding and plumbing issues. The buildings that were buried are still standing there today, although only small parts of them are still safe for the guided tours that go on to this day.
Here it was again, March 29th through April 16th. 6 strangulation.
Can you be thinking when I'm thinking?
Let's have a look.
Mr. Barry, Mr. Kolchak.
Shall we try for 1889?
Yes, and the great Wally Cox. The gentleman you see on the left-hand side of the screen with the glasses is well known to anybody who watched TVs in the 60s and 70s. Unfortunately, he did not live long past the filming of the movie, which is a shame because I think he would have made a tremendous recurring character in the TV series. The red couch that you see on the right-hand side of the screen is actually photographed during one of the recent Seattle Underground tours. The story that is told, because if you look at it, it certainly doesn't look like it's 100 years old. It actually looks like it's some of that disco trash that we used in the 1970s. And the story that's actually told by the Seattle Underground tour is that this was actually left behind by the Kolchak team when they filmed downstairs. So on one hand, I got to say, you should pick up after yourselves, guys. But on the other hand, what a nice, neat piece of Americana to still be there today. After the success of the second movie, ABC decided they wanted to produce a weekly television series instead of doing a third movie. McGavin agreed to return as Kolchak and would also serve as one of the series' executive producers, though he was not credited as such, and this would come back to bite the studio very shortly. An order for 26 episodes was placed, and the series premiered on September 13th, 1974. In retrospect, starting on Friday the 13th was not a good omen. Even though the two movies pulled a rating over 30 each, the series only averaged about a 13.6, which placed it at the bottom of the season. Also, Darren McGavin spent most of his time doing things that they had asked him to do based on the role as a producer. He got involved in script rewrites, editing, set dressing, and a myriad of other chores that normally he would have gotten credit for, but ABC never gave him the credit nor the compensation. So after 20 episodes were made, he asked the network to release him from his contract. They obliged, and the series was canceled after 20 episodes. A special treat was that his wife, Katie Brown, starred with him in the final episode. In a really unusual move, CBS purchased the rights to the show and reran it during their CBS late movie time slot. There were 4 original episodes that Universal went and recut into 2 full-length movies, Crackle of Death and The Demon and the Mummy. This gave them 4 movies to deal with in 16 episodes. As a result, though, the 4 individual episodes were withheld from the syndication package to avoid duplications. The result was such a huge success for CBS that they ran it again in 1981 and again one more time in 1987. In 1990, it was picked up by the Sci-Fi Channel, and Universal retired the 2 edited movies and restored the original 4 episodes for the very first time since 1975. What you're seeing here is just a handful of the myriad of creatures that Carl had to deal with. Vampires, headless people, swamp monsters, robots, werewolves, Indian medicine spirits, zombies, gorillas, lizards, Satan worshippers, you name it, it was there. Each episode featured a different supernatural bad guy. The show pioneered what would later be known as Monster of the Week. Unfortunately, Monster of the Week was not something Darren really wanted to get involved in. So actually, when he asked for his release, one of the other things he cited, other than the amount of work he was doing, was that the series was descending into the Monster of the Week format, and he didn't feel that that was the exact type of thing that he wanted to invest his time in. However, we must point out, nobody had ever done this before. Oh yeah, we had Night Gallery, we had The Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond, Outer Limits. We had all of these shows that did a Monster of the Week, but they didn't use a recurring character. They didn't use a recurring cast. Each episode stood on its own as if it were its own little 1-hour play. So our friends here with Kolchak actually stumbled upon a formula that we now, here in the 21st century, see all of the time in horror and supernatural. It just didn't exist back then. I had mentioned that Chris Carter was a fan of Kolchak the Night Stalker. He had actually said publicly that Kolchak was the inspiration for doing the X-Files. As a tribute, he asked Darren McGavin to appear in an episode of the X-Files as Carl Kolchak. The idea was to set it up to show that Carl's investigative reporting actually ended up being the very beginning of what we would now know as the FBI's X-Files. Unfortunately, Darren McGavin asked him to change the character name to something other than Kolchak. I would assume that while he appreciated his fans, he probably still had a hard heart towards the character in the studios. So Chris created a new character. He named that character Arthur Dale. Darren McGavin played him, and indeed, Arthur Dale was the FBI agent who investigated the very first X-Files back in the 1950s. So even though the names were changed to protect the innocent, the idea was still there. Finally, in the X-Files comeback series in 2015, Chris honored Darren McGavin once again. Darren had passed about 9 years earlier, and Chris actually had a main character in the episode who completely dressed like Kolchak throughout the episode. You see that on the right-hand side of the screen. Just one last nod to a great actor and a great television show. Okay. Today, Kolchak the Night Stalker belongs to NBC because of them buying out the studio that filmed the Universal TV series. This means that all 3 major networks that had the right to the series at one time or another. It started on ABC, went to CBS, and now NBC owns it. So you'll find it on Peacock if you go looking. ABC, however, though, owned the rights to the 2 original movies. Remember, they were made specifically for ABC, unlike the television series, so therefore they had those rights. That meant they could use any character that was in either of those 2 movies, but they could not use any of the other characters that were created in the TV series. So ABC decided they were going to relaunch the series. And in 2015, ironically, the same year as X-Files had its little tribute that we showed you there a moment ago, The Night Stalker returned as a weekly TV show. It bombed terribly after only 6 episodes. The problem with the show was that ABC tried to sell it as a cross between CSI and the X-Files. It took itself way too seriously and literally drowned in its own drama on TV. It's somewhat of an embarrassment. There is, however, one bright light in the original pilot. There is a scene where the new Carl Kolchak, on the left-hand side of the screen, Stuart Townsend, is in an office with Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak. Obviously, this was done through the creative magic of Hollywood. It was a very nice tribute to the creative people who struggled with this TV series. And later on in the series, you would also occasionally see a hat rack with Carl's trademark hat on it, indicating that his presence was still on the set. The WB set up a brand new show called Supernatural. This show would use the exact same Monster of the Week approach to storytelling that Kolchak the Night Stalker did. And while it was serious, it was also much more entertaining by using light comedy as well as some serious monster killing. Obviously, we now know who had the better idea, WB or ABC, since ABC didn't even last 6 episodes, and our friends in Supernatural lasted for 15 seasons. If you haven't seen these shows, please do watch them. I think that you're going to find yourself very pleasantly surprised at your new find. If you are familiar with Kolchak the Night Stalker, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have, just simply reviewing some of the clips and being reminded of just how great the show was, and what a tragedy that it only lasted 1 season.